A black elderly man takes a beating to save a Hell's Angel. But what happens next shocks an entire town. Everyone thought he was just a quiet janitor, until he threw himself between 3 attackers and a dying biker. Now he's in the hospital, barely breathing. And outside, the roar of hundreds of motorcycles fills the air. 300 bikers have come to stand guard, not in anger, but in honor. The town is terrified. The media is swarming. And the old man who acted out of faith finds himself at the center of chaos. Why would a man of peace risk everything for someone the world calls dangerous? What happens when compassion collides with prejudice? And a single act of kindness starts a movement no one saw coming. Can one man's courage heal the hate of an entire town? Or will it tear everything apart before redemption arrives? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The early morning light filtered through the windows of St. Mark's Hospital as Eugene Turner pushed his mop bucket down the quiet hallway. His weathered hands gripped the familiar wooden handle, moving with the same steady rhythm he'd maintained for the past 15 years. The squeaking of his work shoes against the freshly cleaned floor echoed through the corridor, a sound that had become as natural to him as breathing. "Morning, Mr. Jean," called out Nancy, one of the night shift nurses heading home. Her bright smile warmed his heart, reminding him of how his late wife Mary used to greet him each morning. "Morning, child," he replied softly, touching the cross pendant that hung beneath his gray work shirt. It was a gift from Mary, and he never started a day without it. The morning sunshine streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor he'd just cleaned. Eugene paused for a moment, bowing his head in his daily prayer of gratitude. "Lord, thank you for another day to serve," he whispered, his deep voice barely audible in the empty hallway. At 72 years old, Eugene moved more slowly than he used to, but his work remained thorough and precise, a habit ingrained from his 30 years in the Army as a mechanic. Each stroke of the mop was purposeful, each corner attended to with care. The hospital staff often told him he didn't need to work so hard, but Eugene knew no other way. As the morning progressed, he made his way through the pediatric wing, where bright murals of animals decorated the walls. The children's voices brought life to the sterile hospital environment, reminding him of the grandchildren he never had. Mary had passed before they could start their own family, and sometimes the weight of that loss still caught him off guard, even after all these years. By afternoon, Eugene had finished his shift at the hospital and headed to the Veterans Affairs Clinic where he volunteered 3 days a week. The familiar faces of younger veterans greeted him as he entered the building. These men and women, many struggling with the transition to civilian life, had become like family to him. "Mr. Turner, got a minute?" asked Jason, a young Marine who'd returned from Afghanistan with both physical and invisible scars. Eugene nodded, setting aside his worn Bible as the young man settled into the chair beside him. "Some days, sir, I just don't know how to keep going," Jason confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. Eugene placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Son, faith ain't about seeing the whole staircase. It's about taking that first step, then the next, and trusting the Lord to guide your feet." They talked for another hour, Eugene sharing stories of his own struggles and the strength he found in his faith. As the afternoon light began to fade, he bid farewell to the clinic staff and headed to his evening Bible study at First Baptist Church. The drizzling rain had started during the study, and Eugene pulled his worn jacket closer as he stepped out into the evening air. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the wet pavement as he decided to take the longer route home, past the old buildings that held so many memories. This town had changed since his youth. Some changes good, others not so much. Where once stood Mr. Johnson's grocery store, now sat an empty building with boards over the windows. The old movie theater where he'd taken Mary on their first date was now a discount store. Yet the essence of the town remained in its people, in the way neighbors still looked out for each other. The rain continued its gentle pattern as Eugene walked, his thoughts drifting to Mary and their life together. The rose garden he still tenderly maintained had been her pride and joy. Every morning, he spent time among those bushes, pruning and caring for them just as she had taught him. It was his way of keeping her memory alive. As he approached the underpass near Maple Street, something caught his attention. Muffled voices carried through the rain, followed by a dull thud and a grunt of pain. Eugene stopped, his heart racing as he strained to hear more clearly. Another thud echoed off the concrete walls, accompanied by cruel laughter and the sound of someone pleading. Eugene's grip tightened on his mop handle. He'd carried it home to repair the loose head, but now it felt like something else entirely in his hands. For a moment, he hesitated. At 72, he wasn't as strong as he used to be. The sensible thing would be to call the police and wait for help. But the sounds of distress grew more urgent, and Eugene remembered something his drill sergeant had told him decades ago. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite the fear. With a silent prayer, Eugene Turner gripped his mop handle firmly and stepped forward into the shadows of the underpass. The rain continued to fall softly behind him, marking this moment when an ordinary day turned into something else entirely. His footsteps were sure and steady as he moved towards the sounds of violence, driven by the same sense of duty that had guided him through 30 years of military service. The mop handle, worn smooth by years of use, felt solid in his weathered hands, a humble weapon for a humble man about to answer a call he couldn't ignore. The voices grew clearer as he approached, and Eugene could make out the cruel taunts mixed with the victim's pleas. His heart pounded in his chest, but his steps never faltered. He'd faced danger before, in places far from this small Tennessee town, and the lessons of those years stayed with him. Assess the situation, act decisively, protect those who cannot protect themselves. Through the rain-scattered light of the underpass, Eugene could now see several dark figures huddled around someone on the ground. The scene brought back memories of similar moments from his military days, times when the choice between action and inaction meant the difference between life and death. He said one final prayer, his lips moving silently as he continued forward. The cross pendant beneath his shirt seemed to warm against his skin, reminding him of all the times faith had carried him through uncertainty. Eugene Turner, hospital janitor and retired soldier, moved purposefully toward what he knew would be a defining moment, guided by the unwavering moral compass that had directed his entire life. The rain fell steadily outside the underpass, nature's quiet witness to what was about to unfold. Eugene's grip tightened on the mop handle as he closed the final distance, his presence still unnoticed by those ahead. In this moment, he wasn't just a janitor or a retired soldier. He was exactly where he needed to be, doing what needed to be done, regardless of the cost to himself. His shoes scraped against the concrete, alerting the attackers to his presence. As they turned to face this unexpected interruption, Eugene stood tall, his 72 years of life experience evident in his dignified bearing. The mop handle was raised, ready for whatever might come next, as Eugene prepared to intervene in a situation that would change more lives than just his own. The harsh, fluorescent light from the underpass cast long shadows as Eugene moved closer to the source of the commotion. His heart thundered in his chest as the scene before him came into sharp focus. 3 young men, their faces twisted with rage, were surrounding a fallen figure on the wet concrete. Their boots connected again and again with the prone form of a large man in a leather jacket, who had curled into a defensive ball against the relentless assault. Blood mixed with rainwater on the ground, spreading in thin rivulets across the pavement. The biker's face was already swollen, his attempts to shield himself growing weaker with each brutal impact. As Eugene drew closer, he could make out the patch on the back of the victim's jacket. Hell's Angels Tennessee Chapter emblazoned in bold letters across the leather. "Please!" the biker gasped between strikes, his voice thick with pain. "I ain't who you're looking for." One of the attackers laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "Wrong answer," he snarled, bringing his boot down again. Eugene's fingers tightened around the wooden handle of his mop. Despite his age, despite the trembling in his hands, he knew he couldn't walk away. The weight of 72 years pressed against his bones, but the soldier in him, the man who'd sworn to protect others, wouldn't let him turn his back on someone in need. "Stop this!" Eugene's voice boomed through the underpass, startling the attackers. "In the name of God, stop this right now!" The three men whirled around, their expressions shifting from surprise to contempt as they took in the elderly janitor standing before them. The largest of the group, a muscular young man with a shaved head, stepped forward menacingly. "Mind your own business, old man," he growled. "This ain't got nothing to do with you." Eugene planted his feet firmly, raising the mop handle like a staff. "It became my business when I saw you beating a defenseless man." His voice remained steady, even as his heart raced. "Whatever he's done, this isn't the way." The second attacker, wearing a denim jacket with torn sleeves, spat on the ground. "You don't know nothing about what he deserves." "I know that mercy is stronger than vengeance," Eugene replied, taking another step forward. "And I'm telling you to stop." The third man circled around, trying to get behind Eugene. In the dim light, something metallic glinted in his hand, a length of pipe that Eugene hadn't noticed before. The sight sent a chill down his spine, but he held his ground. The first attacker lunged forward suddenly, his fist connecting with Eugene's ribs. Pain exploded through his side, forcing a grunt from his lips, but he managed to stay upright. He swung the mop handle in a wide arc, forcing his assailants to step back. "Please!" Eugene wheezed, fighting to catch his breath. "You're young men. You don't want this on your conscience. Show mercy. It's never too late to choose a better path." For a moment, uncertainty flickered across their faces. Then the man with the pipe raised his weapon, preparing to strike. Eugene didn't think, he just moved, positioning himself between the attackers and the fallen biker. His body became a shield, his arms spread wide. In the distance, police sirens began to wail, their sound growing steadily louder. The attackers exchanged quick, nervous glances. "Cops," the one with the pipe hissed. "We gotta go." They scattered like shadows, their footsteps echoing as they fled into the rainy night. Eugene's legs trembled with relief and exhaustion, and he slowly sank to his knees beside the injured biker. The man's face was a mess of blood and bruises, but his eyes were open, watching Eugene, with a mix of pain and confusion. "Why'd you do that, old man?" he whispered, his words slurred. Eugene tried to respond, but the pain in his side was getting worse. The world started to tilt and spin around him. He was dimly aware of the rain soaking through his clothes as he collapsed onto the concrete beside the biker. Red and blue lights strobed against the walls of the underpass. Voices called out, footsteps approached rapidly. Eugene felt hands touching him, checking his vital signs. Through the haze of pain, he could make out paramedics working quickly, their faces serious as they assessed both him and the biker. They were lifted onto gurneys, wheeled through the rain to waiting ambulances. Eugene's vision began to blur as they loaded him into the vehicle. The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away was the harsh glare of hospital lights overhead, their sterile brightness fading into darkness as the edges of his world grew dim. The steady beeping of medical equipment filled his ears, mixing with the urgent voices of emergency personnel. His ribs screamed in protest with each breath, but somewhere in the fog of his mind, Eugene found peace in knowing he'd done what was right. As the ambulance sped through the rain-slicked streets, the old janitor finally surrendered to the darkness pulling at him, letting it carry him away from the pain and into blessed unconsciousness. The morning sun filtered through the hospital room's blinds, casting thin stripes of light across Eugene Turner's bed. His eyelids fluttered open, immediately greeted by the sterile white ceiling and the steady beeping of monitors. Every breath brought a sharp stab of pain to his left side. Cracked ribs, he guessed, remembering the blow he'd taken the night before. Nurse Lila Sanders approached his bedside, her familiar face creased with concern. "Well, look who's finally awake. How are you feeling, Gene?" "Like I've been kicked by a mule," Eugene admitted, wincing as he tried to adjust his position. His hand went to his forehead, feeling the rough texture of stitches above his right eye. 3 cracked ribs and 8 stitches, Lila confirmed, checking his vitals. "You're lucky it wasn't worse." She paused, her voice softening. "Everyone's talking about what you did, Gene. They're calling you a hero." Eugene shook his head slightly. "Just did what needed doing, that's all." 2 younger nurses walked past his door, their whispered conversation drifting in. "That's him. The janitor who saved the biker. Can you believe he stood up to those thugs at his age?" Before Eugene could process the attention he was receiving, a woman in a crisp blazer appeared in his doorway, clutching a notepad. "Mr. Turner, I'm Sarah Mitchell from Channel 5 News. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions?" Eugene glanced at Nurse Lila, who nodded reassuringly. "Just a few minutes," the nurse warned the reporter. "He needs his rest." Sarah pulled up a chair, her cameraman positioning himself discreetly in the corner. "Mr. Turner, can you tell us what happened last night?" Eugene's voice was soft but steady. "I was walking home from Bible study, heard sounds of fighting under the Marshall Street underpass, found 3 young men attacking someone. Couldn't just walk away. Wouldn't have been right." "You put yourself at risk to save a member of the Hells Angels," Sarah pressed. "Did you know who he was when you intervened?" "Didn't matter who he was," Eugene replied. "When someone's hurt and needs help, you help. That's all there is to it." The interview lasted barely 10 minutes, but by early afternoon, Eugene's story was everywhere. Nurse Lila brought her tablet to show him how the story had spread online. The headlines varied wildly. "Elderly black man risks life to save Hell's Angel." "Local hero proves age no barrier to courage." "Good Samaritan or misguided senior?" Questions raised about intervention. The comment section beneath each article showed an equally divided response. Some praised Eugene's courage and compassion, calling him an example of true Christian values. Others questioned his judgment, suggesting he should have left well enough alone. "Some fools actually wrote that you should have minded your own business," Lila said, scrolling through the comments with disgust. "That you were helping a criminal." Eugene closed his eyes briefly. "People say what they want to say. Doesn't change what's right." Around mid-afternoon, a commotion erupted in the hallway. A gruff voice insisted, "I need to see him. The old man? Turner. Which room?" Moments later, a tall man appeared in Eugene's doorway. His face was heavily bruised, with butterfly bandages across his cheek and jaw. His left arm was in a sling, and he moved stiffly, favoring his right side. This was Wyatt "Ghost" McKinnon, the man Eugene had saved. Ghost stood awkwardly at the threshold, his good hand gripping the doorframe. His eyes, sharp and blue beneath his swollen brow, couldn't quite meet Eugene's gaze. The tension in the room was palpable. "They said you took a hit meant for me." Ghost finally spoke, his voice rough. "Stepped right in front of it." Eugene regarded him calmly. Seemed like the thing to do at the time. "Why?" Ghost's question came out almost angry, but Eugene could hear the confusion beneath it. "You don't know me. I'm not—" He gestured to his leather vest with its patches. "I'm not the kind of man people stick their neck out for." "You're alive," Eugene said simply. "That's enough, thanks." The words seemed to hit Ghost like a physical blow. His tough exterior cracked, shoulders slumping as he leaned heavily against the doorframe. A single tear tracked down his bruised cheek, and he quickly wiped it away with the back of his hand. "I don't—" Ghost started, his voice breaking. He stood there for a long moment, struggling to speak, before finally turning and walking away without another word. Eugene watched him go, saying a quiet prayer for the troubled man. The encounter left him exhausted, and he settled back against his pillows as evening approached. Nurse Lila brought him dinner and turned on the small television mounted on the wall. The news was playing his interview from earlier, his own face looking back at him from the screen. It felt surreal, seeing himself there, hearing the anchors discuss his actions. His name appeared in bold letters beneath his image. Eugene Turner, 72, local hero. As the story played again, Eugene's eyes grew heavy. The pain medication was making him drowsy, and the day's events had worn him out. He drifted off to sleep with the news still playing softly in the background, his name and face now known to thousands who'd never heard of him before. The last thing he heard before sleep took him was the news anchor's voice. In a world often divided by fear and mistrust, Mr. Turner's actions remind us that courage and compassion know no boundaries. The steady beeping of his heart monitor provided a quiet rhythm to his rest, while outside his room, the hospital continued its endless cycle of healing. And somewhere in the building, a troubled biker named Ghost lay awake, wrestling with emotions he couldn't quite name. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Eugene Turner stirred from his hospital bed. His ribs ached with each breath, a sharp reminder of yesterday's events. The familiar sounds of St. Mark's Hospital, the squeak of nurses' shoes, the gentle beeping of monitors, the distant PA system, were suddenly overtaken by something else entirely. A low rumble filled the air, starting as a distant growl and growing steadily louder. The sound was unmistakable to Eugene's trained mechanic's ear: motorcycles, and lots of them. Nurse Lila rushed into his room, her eyes wide with excitement and concern. "Gene, you're not going to believe this," she said, hurrying to the window. Other nurses gathered there too, their faces pressed against the glass. The rumble had become a roar. Eugene could see them now, motorcycle after motorcycle rolling into the hospital parking lot in perfect formation. Their chrome gleamed in the morning light, and their riders sat tall and proud, leather vests displaying patches that marked them as members of the Hells Angels. "I count at least 300 bikes," Lila said, her voice filled with awe. "They're coming from Tennessee, Kentucky, and Georgia, according to the patches." Eugene watched as the bikers dismounted their machines with military precision. Many carried handmade signs, the messages clear even from his third-floor window. "Respect, brotherhood, thank you, Mr. Turner." The scene below quickly transformed into organized chaos. News vans pulled up, reporters spilling out with cameras and microphones at the ready. Hospital security looked overwhelmed, trying to maintain order as curious onlookers gathered at the edges of the parking lot. Mayor Cynthia Lowe arrived within the hour, her silver sedan threading carefully through the sea of motorcycles. Eugene could see her speaking with reporters, her professional smile strained as she gestured calmly. "The situation is under control," her voice carried through the TV in Eugene's room, which was now broadcasting live coverage. While we appreciate the show of gratitude toward Mr. Turner, we ask everyone to remember this is a hospital, and patients need their rest. Through his window, Eugene could see the town dividing before his eyes. On one side of the parking lot, a group of local residents had gathered, their faces pinched with worry. He recognized Mrs. Peterson from his church, clutching her purse tightly as she whispered to others. Several business owners from downtown stood with their arms crossed, eyeing the leather-clad bikers with obvious distrust. But on the other side, something beautiful was happening. Young mothers were bringing their children closer, pointing out the gleaming motorcycles. A local food truck had pulled up, serving coffee to both bikers and hospital staff. Eugene watched as an elderly woman approached a tattooed biker with a plate of homemade cookies, her initial nervousness melting into a warm smile as they began to chat. Nurse Lila returned with Eugene's morning medication. "The hospital administrator's having fits," she said, checking his vital signs. "But I think it's wonderful. They're just showing gratitude, in their own way." Around noon, a knock at the door drew Eugene's attention. Wyatt "Ghost" McKinnon stood there, looking markedly different from the previous day. Though his injuries were still evident, his posture had changed. The defensive anger was gone, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. "May I come in?" Ghost asked quietly. Eugene nodded, gesturing to the chair beside his bed. Ghost moved slowly, his own injuries still clearly paining him. He sat down carefully, running a hand through his graying hair before speaking. "I didn't organize this," he said, gesturing toward the window. "But when word got out about what you did, well, brotherhood means something to us. They came on their own." Eugene studied the younger man's face. "Seems like an awful lot of fuss over doing what's right." Ghost's eyes grew wet. "That's just it, Mr. Turner. What's right?" He paused, struggling with his words. "In my world, what's right isn't always so clear. But you didn't hesitate. You gave me a second chance. We don't forget that." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant rumble of motorcycles as more riders continued to arrive. "Some folks in town seem worried," Eugene observed. Ghost nodded. "Can't blame them. Our reputation, well, it's not always undeserved, but nobody here will cause any trouble. You have my word on that." Throughout the afternoon, the scene outside continued to evolve. Local police maintained a careful presence, but the bikers remained peaceful, organizing themselves into shifts to maintain their vigil. They collected trash, helped direct traffic, and even assisted elderly patients making their way into the hospital. Mayor Lowe made several appearances, her initial tension gradually easing as the day progressed without incident. Eugene watched through his window as she actually stopped to talk with several bikers, her body language shifting from guarded to genuinely interested. As evening approached, the golden light of sunset painted the parking lot in warm hues. The hundreds of motorcycles cast long shadows across the asphalt, and the numbers of both supporters and onlookers had thinned somewhat. But a solid presence remained, the bikers settling in for the night with camping chairs and thermoses of coffee. Eugene sat in the growing darkness of his room, hands folded in prayer. "Lord," he whispered, "let there be peace here. Let something good come from all this." Outside his window, the low murmur of conversations mixed with the occasional motorcycle engine, a reminder that his simple act of mercy had sparked something much larger than himself. Nurse Lila came in for her final check before the night shift. "Quite a day," she said softly, adjusting his pillows. "You've started something, Gene, though I don't think any of us knows quite what yet." Eugene smiled gently. "Sometimes the good Lord works in mysterious ways," he said. "We just have to trust in His plan." As night settled fully over St. Mark's Hospital, the parking lot remained illuminated by the headlights of news vans and the occasional flash of cameras. The bikers maintained their quiet vigil, their respect for Eugene Turner transforming into something that would soon change not just their lives, but the entire community's perception of brotherhood and mercy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot, now transformed into a makeshift camp of chrome and leather. News vans lined the perimeter, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Camera crews hustled between motorcycles, their equipment glinting in the early light. The steady rumble of engines mixed with the chatter of reporters doing their live broadcasts. Inside his hospital room, Eugene Turner watched it all unfold with quiet amazement. His ribs still ached with each breath, and the stitches on his brow itched something fierce, but he maintained his usual calm demeanor. A knock at the door drew his attention away from the window. "Brother Turner." Reverend Samuel Harlan's warm voice preceded him into the room. The pastor's familiar presence brought a smile to Eugene's face. "Quite the spectacle you've created out there." "Not my doing, Reverend," Eugene said softly. "Just tried to help someone in need." Reverend Harlan pulled up a chair, his eyes bright with purpose. "That's exactly why God chose you for this moment, Gene. Your simple act of mercy has opened a door none of us even knew existed." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "We need to let God use this moment. He's bringing together people who'd never otherwise meet, breaking down walls built by fear and prejudice." Outside, Ghost McKinnon was dealing with his own challenges. He moved carefully among his brothers, his injuries still evident in his stiff movements. "Keep it peaceful," he reminded a group of younger riders. "No revving engines near the hospital entrance. Remember why we're here." Throughout the morning, something unexpected began to unfold. When an elderly woman with a walker approached the hospital entrance, two tattooed bikers immediately stepped forward to help her. They guided her carefully through the parking lot, one carrying her bag, while the other steadied her arm. In the hospital cafeteria, several bikers had pooled their money to buy coffee and sandwiches for the nursing staff, working double shifts. Small gestures, but they began to chip away at the town's initial fear. As afternoon settled in, Eugene received another visitor. Ghost entered the room, moving more easily than the day before but still bearing the marks of his attack. "Mind if we talk?" Ghost asked, settling into the chair by the bed. Eugene gestured welcomingly. "Been hoping we might." Their conversation started hesitantly, but soon deepened. Eugene spoke of his 25 years in the Army, of maintaining helicopters in Vietnam and tanks in Desert Storm. He described the discipline that had carried him through, the faith that had sustained him. "Never had that kind of structure," Ghost admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "My old man split when I was 4. Mom did her best, but..." He shrugged, the gesture speaking volumes. "Found the brotherhood I was looking for with the wrong crowd at first. Took me years to find something better with the angels." Eugene listened without judgment, recognizing the hurt child beneath the hardened exterior. Their quiet conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. "Where is he? Where's my grandfather?" The door burst open, and Denise Turner strode in, her nurse's training evident in how quickly she assessed Eugene's condition. Her face was tight with worry, and something else. Fear. "Granddad, what were you thinking?" She hugged him carefully, mindful of his injuries, then turned a suspicious glance toward Ghost. "I saw the news. All those bikers out there. These people are dangerous." Ghost stood quietly, understanding her reaction but clearly stung by it. He moved toward the door, but Eugene's voice stopped him. "So was the Good Samaritan's Road," Eugene said firmly. "Denise, honey, sit down. There's someone I want you to meet properly." Denise's protective instincts warred with her respect for her grandfather. Finally, she perched on the edge of the bed, her posture still tense. "This is Wyatt McKinnon," Eugene introduced. "The man I helped that night." Ghost extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Denise shook it. "Your grandfather saved my life," he said simply. "We're here to make sure he stays safe while he heals." The tension in the room slowly began to ease as they talked. Ghost shared stories about his own daughter, now grown and distant. Denise spoke of her work in the Atlanta emergency room. Eugene watched them both, seeing bridges being built in real time. As evening approached, the activity outside the hospital settled into a quieter rhythm. The news vans remained, their lights casting blue-white glows across the parking lot. The bikers had organized themselves into shifts, maintaining their vigil while ensuring the hospital's normal operations weren't disrupted. Inside, Eugene's room had become an unlikely meeting place. Reverend Harlan returned with coffee for everyone. Ghost's brothers stopped by in small groups, each wanting to thank the man who'd saved their brother. Denise gradually relaxed, her medical training allowing her to see beyond the tattoos and leather to the humanity beneath. The night deepened, but the peaceful gathering continued. Stories were shared, laughter occasionally echoed down the halls, and slowly, the walls between these different worlds began to crumble. Yet outside, beyond the circle of light and newfound understanding, tensions still simmered in the town. Not everyone was ready to accept this unexpected invasion of leather-clad guardians, this disruption of their quiet community's normal rhythms. Eugene watched it all from his bed, his pain medication making him drowsy, but his heart full. He saw how Ghost managed his brothers with quiet authority, ensuring they remained respectful of the hospital environment. He noticed how Denise's defensive posture gradually softened as she witnessed small acts of kindness from the bikers, and he felt the truth of Reverend Harlan's words. God was indeed using this moment, though none of them could yet see where it might lead. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as Gene watched from his window. 3 days had passed since the bikers arrived, and the media circus had only grown larger. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. Inside his room, the television droned softly. A well-dressed commentator on National Morning America gestured dramatically as footage of the hospital played behind him. "What we're seeing in Tennessee is an unlikely friendship that's dividing America," he declared. "The question remains, should we celebrate this connection between an elderly veteran and a notorious biker gang, or should we be concerned about the message it sends?" Gene shook his head, reaching for the remote to turn it off, when Ghost entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the hospital cafeteria. "They're still at it, huh?" Ghost handed Gene a cup, his face troubled. "Sorry about all this attention. Never meant for it to blow up like this." "Not your doing?" Gene replied, taking a careful sip. His ribs still ached when he moved, but the pain was gradually subsiding. "Media's gonna do what media does." Outside, a new commotion drew their attention. A group of about 20 people had gathered at the hospital entrance, carrying signs with angry messages. "No gangs in our town," and "Protect our children" among them. Ghost's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Instead, he pulled out his phone and sent a quick text. Within minutes, several of his brothers appeared in the parking lot, quietly moving their bikes further back from the entrance, giving the protesters more space. Throughout the day, Gene watched as members of the Hells Angels went about their self-appointed tasks around the hospital grounds. 2 burly men in leather vests carefully repaired broken slats on outdoor benches. Another group, led by a tall biker with gray-streaked hair, painted over some graffiti that had appeared overnight on the hospital's rear wall. "Your brothers seem determined to keep busy," Gene observed when Ghost returned that afternoon. Ghost nodded, settling into what had become his usual chair. "Least we can do. Figure we owe you more than we can ever repay." He fell silent for a moment, his face darkening with what looked like guilt. "Thing is, Jean, there's something you should know about that night." Jean waited patiently as Ghost struggled with his words. "Those guys who attacked me, it wasn't random." Ghost's voice grew hoarse. "Years back, before I found my way to the Angels, I ran with a different crowd. Did things I'm not proud of. Those men? They were from the Iron Disciples, a gang I helped take down when I switched sides. They came looking for payback." Tears welled in Ghost's eyes, something Jean had never expected to see. "They came for me. You got hit 'cause of my past. All this—" He gestured at Jean's injuries. "It's on me." Jean absorbed this information quietly, watching the younger man's anguish. After a thoughtful moment, he spoke softly. "Then maybe it's time your past meets forgiveness." Ghost looked up, startled. "Just like that? After what I just told you?" "Forgiveness ain't about what's deserved," Jean replied. "It's about what's needed. Would you mind if we prayed together?" For the first time since they'd met, Ghost seemed truly uncertain. But he nodded, and Jean reached out his hand. Ghost took it, his calloused palm rough against Jean's. "Lord," Jean began, his voice gentle but firm, "we come before you with heavy hearts and troubled spirits. We ask for your guidance in letting go of past wrongs, both those we've suffered and those we've caused. Help us find the strength to forgive and the courage to accept forgiveness." As they prayed, Ghost's grip tightened, and tears rolled freely down his cheeks. The tough biker exterior cracked, revealing the wounded soul beneath. Their moment of peace was shattered by shouting from outside. They looked up to see a crowd gathering near the hospital entrance. The protesters had grown in number, and several townspeople had joined them. Facing them were some of the bikers, their stance defensive but not aggressive. "Stay here," Ghost said, rising quickly. "I better handle this." Through the window, Jean watched as Ghost strode into the growing confrontation. The shouting grew louder, with accusations flying from both sides. Someone pushed, another shoved back. It was like watching a match being struck near gasoline. A security guard tried to intervene, but the tension had already boiled over. A protester's sign went flying. A biker's bandana was yanked. What started as a verbal confrontation threatened to escalate into something much worse. Ghost's voice cut through the chaos, commanding his brothers to step back. Hospital security finally managed to separate the groups, but the damage was done. The evening news would have fresh footage to fuel their narrative of a town divided. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Jean sat in his room thinking about the day's events. The television was off. He'd had enough of the media's spin. Instead, he focused on the prayer journal in his lap, writing his thoughts about forgiveness, redemption, and the strange ways God chose to work in people's lives. A nurse poked her head in to check his vital signs, smiling warmly. "Those bikers fixed the bench my mother always sits on when she visits," she mentioned while taking his blood pressure. "Never would have expected that." "Expect the unexpected?" Jean replied with a gentle smile. "That's where grace usually shows up." Outside his window, the protesters had gone home for the night, but their signs lay scattered on the ground like fallen leaves. The bikers maintained their vigil, their bikes gleaming under the parking lot lights. The scene was calm for now, but Jean could feel it in his bones. This was just the quiet before a bigger storm. The divisions in the town were deepening, the lines being drawn more firmly with each passing day. As Jean settled back against his pillows, he thought about Ghost's confession, about forgiveness, and about the hard work of healing that lay ahead, not just for individuals, but for an entire community. 7 days after the attack, Gene's doctor finally cleared him for discharge. The morning sun painted the hospital room in warm light as he carefully buttoned his freshly pressed shirt, trying not to aggravate his healing ribs. A knock at the door made him look up. "Ready to go home, old man?" Ghost stood in the doorway, his leather vest gleaming with patches and pins. "More than ready," Gene replied with a smile. "Though I hear you folks are planning quite a send-off." Ghost grinned. "You could say that. The brothers want to do this right." Outside, the rumble of hundreds of motorcycles filled the air. Gene walked slowly through the hospital corridors, supported by Ghost on one side and a nurse on the other. Hospital staff lined the hallways, offering warm goodbyes and thank yous. Some had tears in their eyes. When they reached the entrance, Gene stopped short. The sight before him took his breath away. 300 motorcycles stretched across the parking lot in perfect formation, their chrome gleaming in the sunlight. Each bike carried a rider wearing a vest with the distinctive death's head patch of the Hells Angels. "Your chariot awaits," Ghost said, gesturing to a specially modified sidecar attached to his own motorcycle. The seat had been padded with extra cushions for Gene's comfort. News vans lined the street, their cameras already rolling. Police cruisers blocked off intersections ahead, their lights flashing. The mayor stood nearby, looking both impressed and anxious about the spectacle unfolding in his small town. Gene settled carefully into the sidecar, and Ghost handed him a new leather jacket, sized to fit him perfectly, with "Honorary Brother" embroidered across the back. "The club had it made special," Ghost explained. "You've earned it." The procession began with a thunderous roar. Ghost led the way, with Gene beside him in the sidecar. Behind them, hundreds of bikes moved in perfect formation, creating a river of chrome and leather through the streets of the small Tennessee town. People lined the sidewalks, their reactions mixed. Some waved and cheered. Others watched with uncertainty. Children pointed excitedly at the parade of motorcycles, while their parents held them close. As they passed the town square, Gene noticed something different. The fearful stares that had greeted the bikers a week ago were giving way to something else. Curiosity, and maybe even respect. Outside the grocery store, an elderly woman waved at a group of bikers she clearly recognized. "Your brothers have been busy," Gene commented to Ghost at a stoplight. Ghost nodded. "Figure if people are going to stare at us anyway, might as well give them something good to see." Over the past few days, the bikers had become an unexpected force for good in the community. They'd helped Mrs. Peterson carry her groceries, fixed Mr. Thompson's broken fence. One group had spent an entire day at the Veterans Memorial Park, pulling weeds and repainting weathered benches. The procession wound through town, past the church where Gene attended Bible study, past the VA clinic where he counseled younger veterans. At each intersection, people stopped and stared. Traffic came to a complete halt. It was as if the whole town held its breath, watching this unlikely parade pass by. Finally, they turned onto Gene's street. The modest one-story house with its carefully tended rose garden came into view. Ghost eased the motorcycle to a stop, and the thunder of engines behind them gradually fell silent. Gene needed help getting out of the sidecar. His ribs still ached, a reminder of that rainy night under the bridge. Ghost supported him as they walked up the path to his front porch. The steps posed a challenge. Gene had to take them one at a time, Ghost's strong arm steady beside him. At the top, Gene paused to catch his breath, looking out over the sea of bikes and riders that filled his usually quiet street. "Come inside for a minute," Gene said to Ghost. "There's something I want to give you." Inside, The house was exactly as he'd left it that fateful evening. Neat, modest, filled with memories of Mary. Gene made his way to the bookshelf and carefully retrieved a well-worn Bible bound in soft brown leather. "This was Mary's," he said, running his fingers over the cover where his late wife's name was embossed in gold. "She read it every morning and every night for 43 years, made notes in the margins, marked passages that spoke to her heart." Ghost stood awkwardly, unsure how to respond to such an intimate offering. "You ever get lost again?" Gene said, pressing the Bible into Ghost's hands. "Read this. Mary's notes. They have a way of pointing to the light when everything seems dark." Ghost's fingers trembled as he accepted the gift. "I can't take this. It's too precious." "Mary would want you to have it," Gene insisted. "She always said good books find their way to the people who need them most." The moment was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass. They rushed to the window. Well, Ghost rushed while Gene moved as quickly as his injuries allowed. Outside, 3 young men were running away from the house, leaving destruction in their wake. Windows lay shattered. Rocks littered the floor. But worst of all was the spray-painted message that blazed across the front of Gene's house in angry red letters, "Traitor to your own." Several bikers started their engines, ready to chase down the vandals, but Ghost's raised hand stopped them. He turned to Gene, his face twisted with guilt. "This is my fault," he said, his voice breaking. "All of it. The attack, your injuries, and now this. I brought this chaos into your life." "Son, you didn't spray paint those words," Gene replied firmly. "You didn't throw those rocks." But Ghost wasn't listening. He carefully placed Mary's Bible on the coffee table and backed away toward the door. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Before Gene could stop him, Ghost was down the steps and on his bike. The engine roared to life, and he peeled away from the curb, leaving his brothers watching in confusion. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Ghost and his motorcycle were long gone, leaving only tire tracks and questions behind. Gene stood in his doorway, watching the space where Ghost had disappeared. The bikers remained, shifting uncomfortably, waiting for direction from a leader who was no longer there. The morning light revealed the full extent of the vandalism. Broken glass glittering on the ground, hateful words stark against white paint, roses trampled in the garden Mary had loved so much. But what hurt most was the Bible sitting untouched on the coffee table, waiting for hands that might never return to open it. The night wrapped Gene's neighborhood in a heavy blanket of darkness. 2 days had passed since Ghost's departure, and an uneasy quiet had settled over the street. Even with several bikers still keeping watch, sleep came fitfully to Gene. His body ached from his injuries, but it was his heart that felt the heaviest burden. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Gene stirred in his bed. Something wasn't right. Through his partially opened window, an acrid smell drifted in. Smoke. His eyes snapped open, and he could see an orange glow flickering through the curtains. The porch was on fire. Gene's military training kicked in. He rolled carefully out of bed, staying low where the air was clearest. The smoke was getting thicker now, seeping under his front door like a sinister fog. He grabbed his phone from the bedside table with trembling fingers and dialed 911. "Fire at 423 Oak Street," he managed to say between coughs. "Front porch is burning." Next door, Sarah Mitchell, his neighbor of 20 years, was already awake. She saw the flames from her kitchen window where she'd been getting a glass of water. "Fire!" she screamed, running outside in her nightgown. "Someone help! Gene's house is on fire!" Lights began flicking on up and down the street. People emerged from their homes, some still in pajamas. The few bikers who remained on watch sprang into action, racing to Jean's house with garden hoses and fire extinguishers from their saddlebags. "Mr. Turner!" Sarah called out, her voice cracking with fear. "Jean, are you in there?" Jean tried to make his way to the back door, but the smoke was getting thicker. His lungs burned, and his recent injuries made movement difficult. He stumbled, catching himself against the wall. The world started to spin. Through the haze, he heard sirens in the distance. Neighbors were shouting, water was spraying, but it all seemed to be coming from very far away. The last thing Jean remembered was strong hands grabbing him, pulling him toward fresh air before everything went dark. When he opened his eyes again, he was in an ambulance. An oxygen mask covered his face, and paramedics were checking his vital signs. "Sir, can you hear me?" one of them asked. "You've inhaled a lot of smoke. We're taking you to St. Mark's." Jean tried to nod, but even that small movement sent his head spinning. Through the ambulance's rear windows, he could see the firefighters still working on his house. The flames were under control now, but the damage was evident. His front porch was a charred skeleton of its former self. At the hospital, doctors admitted him immediately. The smoke inhalation had weakened his already compromised system, and his oxygen levels were dangerously low. As nurses hooked him up to monitors and adjusted his oxygen flow, Detective Martinez from the local police department appeared in his room. "Mr. Turner," Martinez said gently, "we have reason to believe this wasn't a random act of violence. The fire was deliberately set, and we found this spray painted on your sidewalk." He held up a photo showing the words "Ghost's Pet" in black paint. Jean closed his eyes, his heart heavy. The rival gang was using him to get to Ghost. Outside his room, he could hear the growing commotion. News vans were arriving, reporters clamoring for updates. The remaining Hells Angels members who had stayed in town were gathering in the parking lot, their anger palpable even from Jean's fourth-floor room. "We can't let this stand," one biker growled loud enough for Jean to hear through his open window. "They tried to burn him alive in his own home." "Ghost would want us to make them pay," another added. Jean struggled to sit up, removing his oxygen mask despite the nurse's protests. "Please," he called out weakly, "I need to speak to them." Through the glass walls of his room, he could see the group of bikers in the hallway, their leather vests and patches a stark contrast to the sterile hospital environment. They filed in, filling his room with the scent of leather and motor oil. "Don't," Jean said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Don't repay evil with evil. Let me handle this the Lord's way." "But they could have killed you," one of the younger riders protested. Jean shook his head slowly. "Violence brings more violence. Hatred brings more hatred. The cycle has to stop somewhere. Let me handle this my way." The bikers shifted uncomfortably, torn between their respect for Jean and their ingrained instinct for retaliation. The tension in the hospital grew as police set up barricades outside, trying to maintain order between the media circus, concerned citizens, and the increasingly agitated bikers. It was nearly dawn when a familiar figure slipped into Jean's room. Ghost had somehow made it past the police barricades and hospital security. His face was haggard, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep or tears. Maybe both. "I heard what happened," Ghost said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I came to say goodbye. For good this time." He ran a hand through his unkempt hair. "I'm poison, Jean. Everything I touch turns to ash. Look what they did to your home, just because you showed me kindness." Jean reached out with a trembling hand, grabbing Ghost's wrist with surprising strength. "If you run from grace," he whispered, his voice still rough from the smoke, "you'll never find peace." Ghost's face crumpled, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I don't deserve grace," he choked out. "I don't deserve any of this. Your kindness, your friendship, your faith in me." "None of us deserve grace," Jean replied softly. "That's what makes it grace." For a long moment, Ghost stood there, tears falling silently. Then, without another word, he gently extracted his hand from Jean's grip and backed away toward the door. The last thing Jean saw was Ghost's silhouette disappearing into the hallway, leaving behind only the lingering question of whether he would ever see the troubled biker again. Dawn was breaking outside, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Jean lay back against his pillows, his breathing labored despite the oxygen mask. The doctors had said he would recover, but the road ahead would be challenging. Yet, as he watched the sun rise over the city, Jean's faith remained unshaken. He had planted seeds of grace. Now all he could do was pray they would take root in Ghost's troubled heart. The hallways of St. Mark's Hospital felt different now. The thunderous rumble of motorcycle engines that had become so familiar over the past weeks had faded into memory, leaving behind an unsettling quiet. Gene Turner sat in his hospital bed, watching sunlight crawl across the linoleum floor. His breathing had improved, but the doctors still insisted on regular oxygen treatments. "Granddad, please be reasonable," Denise said, adjusting his pillows for the third time that morning. Her face showed the strain of sleepless nights spent in the uncomfortable hospital chair. "You can't stay here after what happened. Come back to Atlanta with me. I have plenty of room, and there are excellent hospitals where I can keep an eye on you." Jean patted her hand gently. "Baby girl, I appreciate your worry, but this is my home." "A home someone tried to burn down," Denise's voice cracked with emotion. "They could have killed you." "This town still has work to do," Jean replied softly, looking out the window at the streets below. "And so do I." Denise shook her head, frustrated tears welling in her eyes. "You've done enough. More than enough. Let someone else fight these battles." The room fell silent, except for the steady beep of monitors. Jean thought about Ghost, wondering where the troubled biker had disappeared to this time. His Bible still sat on the bedside table, unopened since Ghost's departure. Outside, Reverend Harlan was organizing something in the hospital parking lot. Jean could see people gathering, some carrying candles despite the daylight. The pastor had announced a prayer vigil, extending invitations to both townspeople and any remaining bikers. It was his way of trying to bridge the divide that had grown even wider since the fire. "Look at that," Jean said, nodding toward the window. "Black, white, young, old, all coming together to pray. That's why I can't leave, Denise. God is moving in this place." Denise moved to the window, watching as more people arrived. Some wore leather jackets with patches, though far fewer than before. Others came in church clothes or work uniforms. They formed a circle, holding unlit candles, waiting for evening to fall. "Do you think he'll come back?" Denise asked quietly, knowing her grandfather would understand who she meant. Jean sighed. "That's between him and the Lord. All we can do is pray." As afternoon faded into evening, the crowd outside grew larger. Reverend Harlan's voice carried up to Jean's window as he led the group in prayers for healing, not just for Jean's physical recovery, but for the healing of their divided community. The first drops of rain began to fall, just as darkness settled in. Instead of scattering, the vigil participants pulled closer together, sharing umbrellas and jacket covers to keep their candles lit. The tiny flames flickered like stars against the gathering gloom. Jean sat in his wheelchair by the window, declining Denise's suggestion to rest in bed. The rain grew steadier, drumming against the glass. It was just like that first night under the underpass, when he'd heard those muffled sounds and chosen to step into the darkness rather than walk away. "Sometimes," Jean said softly, more to himself than to Denise, "God speaks loudest in the rain." He pressed his hand against the cool window glass, watching the candlelight below blur through the streaking raindrops. His quiet prayers joined those rising from the parking lot, asking not for safety or comfort, but for Grace to touch the hearts that needed it most. The rain continued to fall as night deepened, and still the vigil held steady. Gene remained at his window, a silent sentinel, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the circle of candlelight. Searching, perhaps, for a familiar silhouette that had not yet returned. The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when Gene stirred in his hospital bed. A distant rumble made his eyes open slowly, like thunder approaching from miles away. But this wasn't thunder. He knew this sound. The steady growl of motorcycles grew louder, and a faint smile crossed his weathered face. Through his window, he watched as the first bikes appeared, their chrome glinting in the early light. Leading the pack was a familiar figure, Ghost, sitting tall on his motorcycle, no longer wearing his leather cut. Instead, he wore a pristine white t-shirt, and as more bikes rolled in, Gene could see they all matched. In bold black letters across their backs, the shirts proclaimed, "Grace rides with us." "Lord have mercy," Gene whispered, his eyes growing misty. Hundreds of motorcycles filled the parking lot, their riders dismounting with careful precision. The scene was different from their last arrival. No revving engines, no showing off. They moved with purpose and restraint, forming orderly lines as they gathered in front of the hospital. Denise rushed into the room, her eyes wide. "Granddad, you need to see this!" "I see it, baby girl," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Help me get to that window." As Denise wheeled him closer, they watched Ghost walking purposefully toward Reverend Harlan, who stood near the hospital entrance. The contrast between them was stark, the tattooed biker and the silver-haired pastor, but there was no tension in their meeting. Ghost extended his hand to the pastor. "We came to finish what he started," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "That old man showed us what grace looks like. Now it's our turn to show we learned something." From their trucks and bike compartments, the riders began unloading supplies, lumber, tools, flowers, and building materials. Local folks who had gathered to watch stood amazed as the bikers organized themselves into work crews. "They're going to rebuild your house, Granddad," Denise said softly, squeezing his shoulder. News vans arrived, their cameras capturing the extraordinary sight. But unlike before, they weren't filming conflict or tension. Instead, their lenses focused on scenes of unity. A gray-haired church deacon helping a tattooed biker measure lumber, a young mother offering water to workers, veterans in service caps sharing stories with riders wearing "Grace Rides with Us" shirts. Through his window, Gene watched as Ghost directed the operation with quiet authority. The man's usual hardness had softened, replaced by something new. Purpose, perhaps, or peace. When townspeople approached offering to help, Ghost welcomed them with handshakes and genuine smiles. "Look at that," Gene murmured, pointing to where Mrs. Henderson from his Bible study group was organizing a lunch line with 3 bikers helping her set up tables. "That woman wouldn't even walk on the same side of the street as them last week." The morning stretched into afternoon, and the crowd grew larger. People who had locked their doors during the bikers' first visit now brought casseroles and cold drinks. Children who had been kept inside played nearby, fascinated by the motorcycles that now sat quiet and unthreatening. Gene's nurse came in to check his vitals, shaking her head in amazement at the scene below. "Never thought I'd see anything like this in our town," she said, adjusting his oxygen. "Those men out there, they're not what we thought they were, are they?" "No, ma'am," Gene replied. "They're just people looking for grace, same as all of us." The barrier that had divided the town was crumbling, not with the crash of destruction, but with the steady rhythm of hammers and the quiet conversations of former strangers working side by side. News crews interviewed both bikers and locals, capturing the transformation that was happening in real time. Through it all, Gene sat at his window, a witness to the miracle of reconciliation unfolding below. His body might still be weak from the fire and smoke, but his spirit soared, watching grace do its perfect work in the hearts of his community. The Grace Rides With Us shirts moved through the crowd like beacons, their message more powerful than any patch or club colors could ever be. They were no longer symbols of fear, but of hope. Hope that had started with one old man's choice to step into darkness, carrying nothing but faith and a mop handle. The morning sun streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Mark's Church, casting rainbow patterns across pews filled to capacity. The sight inside was remarkable. Leather-clad bikers sat shoulder to shoulder with grandmothers in their Sunday best, their floral hats bobbing as they shared hymnals with tattooed hands. Reverend Harlan stood at the pulpit, his eyes scanning the unprecedented congregation. "Today's sermon," he began, his voice warm and steady, "is about the Good Samaritan, about how help comes from unexpected places, and how God's love knows no boundaries." Gene sat in his wheelchair at the front, Denise beside him. His body was still weak, but his spirit glowed with quiet joy as he watched Ghost slip into a pew near the back, looking uncomfortable in a clean white shirt. As Reverend Harlan finished his sermon, Ghost stood up. The congregation grew silent as he made his way to the front, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Before everyone, he knelt in front of Gene, his hands trembling as he removed his leather patch, the symbol of his old life. "This man," Ghost said, his voice thick with emotion, "took a beating meant for me. He could have walked away, but he didn't." He placed the patch on the altar. "I want to live like he does, from now on." Tears flowed freely throughout the church. Denise, who had once feared these men, stepped forward and wrapped Ghost in a tight embrace. "Thank you for coming back," she whispered, loud enough for nearby pews to hear. The congregation erupted in cheers and applause. Even the most conservative church members stood, handkerchiefs dabbing at eyes, as decades of prejudice melted away in that sacred moment. That evening, as the sun set, a line of motorcycles escorted Gene home. The street leading to his house glowed with hundreds of candles, held by neighbors and friends, old and new. His home, rebuilt with love and labor, stood as a testament to transformation. The media crews captured it all, their evening reports already calling it the day the angels came to church. The late summer breeze carried the sweet scent of fresh roses across Gene's rebuilt porch. He sat in his favorite rocking chair, a steaming cup of tea warming his weathered hands as he watched the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. From inside the house, he could hear Ghost moving about, putting away tools from their day's work at the Veterans Affairs Clinic. These days, Ghost worked alongside Gene, trading his motorcycle for a mop, finding purpose in serving others. Together they counseled young veterans, Ghost's own struggles becoming a powerful testimony of change. The town had transformed, too. At the local food pantry, leather-clad bikers now stacked cans beside church volunteers. Mayor Lowe, who had once viewed the bikers with suspicion, had personally thanked Gene just yesterday, shaking his hand with genuine warmth. "Some tea left?" Ghost asked, stepping onto the porch with his work boots off, a house rule he'd learned to respect. "Always," Gene smiled, gesturing to the extra cup he kept ready. As they sat together, watching the day fade, Gene's thoughts drifted to Mary. "You know," he said softly, "I thought I'd lost everything when Mary died, but the Lord wasn't done writing my story." The sound of children's laughter floated up from the street, mixing with the distant rumble of motorcycles, no longer a sound that caused concern, but one that meant family was near. Ghost shifted in his chair, a peaceful expression on his face. "Never thought I'd say this, but church feels like home." Jean chuckled warmly. The Lord's army don't all wear suits. Some ride Harleys. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, witnesses to a peace that had seemed impossible just months before. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.